Okay, so we should have our bell ringer done, and we should have our guided notes pulled up so we can move into filling those out and getting today's lesson. So today and tomorrow, we should be able to explain the process of speciation. So let's dive in. Okay, the past couple of days, weeks, it feels like it's been forever, we've been talking about natural selection. That's when those organisms with the positive traits survive, reproduce, and pass down those traits to the offspring, while the ones without them die off. So one thing I want us to really keep in mind and don't forget is that natural selection is how that process of evolution can happen. So evolution, just a reminder, is how populations of a species can change over a long period of time. And when I say long period of time, I'm not talking like a week, a month, 10 years, even 100 years. I'm talking like thousands and millions of years. So this is a very long process. And like I said, they're shifting, changing their characteristics over time. So natural selection is one way that can happen, but there are other ways evolution can happen. And that's what we're going to talk about today, which is speciation. Speciation. So the word's a little long. You might think that another long term, I don't want to think about it, but it's really easy because it sounds like species. And that's exactly what it's talking about. It's just the creation of a new species. So a brand new species is being made. So what the heck? How does that happen? Well, first, let's determine what even makes a species a species. Like, what's the cutoff? How do we know if two organisms are in the same species or if they're two separate ones? So there are two rules that we follow to know that a species is a species. So first, these two organisms, they must be able to reproduce together. They must be able to go through that sexual reproduction and create a new offspring. If they can't do that together, they are not in the same species. So, let's look at this group of deer right here. So these two deer, they're in the same species, so they are able to reproduce and create an offspring. See a little check mark. They passed the test. This deer and this rabbit, they're awfully cute together, but they're not going to be reproducing together. No deer bunny hybrid is going to happen. That would be a little weird. So that's not enough though. Like, two different species can technically make an offspring, but there's a second rule that they have to follow to be classified in the same species. So they can reproduce, make a new offspring. That offspring must be able to reproduce with another offspring coming from that species. So let me break that down a little bit more. The offspring are fertile. You may have heard this word before, maybe you haven't, but fertile just means that you have the ability to reproduce. So two organisms might make an offspring, but if that offspring is infertile, or meaning that they can't reproduce, you might hear the word sterile. If that offspring can't have a baby, then those two organisms aren't in the same species. So let's say these two deer have an offspring, two other deer also have an offspring. If their offspring can then reproduce together, they are in the same species. We'll get a little bit of practice with that because that part can be a little tricky. But that's what it takes to be in the same species. Okay, now that we got that part settled, let's actually talk about that speciation, or the creation of a new species. So how does that happen? Because that sounds like it might be complicated. It's not. It's pretty easy. So there are three major steps that have to take place. So first, we have this original population. For this example, we're going to use beetles. So we have a population or a group of a species of beetles living in one area. They're living in one group. First, something has to happen that is going to make the one group become two isolated groups, or they are completely separated. So let's say isolated. Isolated. Oh, I was getting really good at spelling and now it's going back again. Okay, so you have your group. something happens. In this case, we're going to say a river. There was a flood and this new river formed. So these beetles are completely separated or isolated into two separate groups. So this is completely, as in these beetles are not in any way communicating, meeting up with, they're not even talking to these other beetles. They're completely separated. The important part to think about this is since they are separated, they are not reproducing with each other. So this group over here, these beetles are mingling and mating with the beetles in the same group. And same with these beetles over here. These beetles are mating with each other, but they can't cross that river. So they're not crossing that river to mate with each other. The groups are not mingling. They're totally isolated or separated. Okay, so step 2, what's going to happen is these two separate groups, they may go through some genetic mutations, which is that change in the genes. So let's say in this case, group, we'll call this the top group. The top group up here gets a mutation that it looks like it's changing their color a bit. So you have a green color pop up in the beetles, and again, mutations can be passed down to the next generation. So you see over time, as more and more of these beetles are reproducing, that green color is being passed along because they are reproducing with each other. Now, since they're not reproducing with this group, if that mutation doesn't happen, it's not going to be passed down because that green color isn't present in that group. So as these two groups reproduce, this group is getting more and more green. This group is just staying the same because they never had that mutation. So they are, over time, looking pretty different from each other. Okay, so eventually, in step 3, a lot of time is going to pass. Those two groups are going to keep reproducing and keep reproducing until over time they can become so different from each other. And it doesn't just have to be color. It can be a number of things. It can be how their bodies are actually made up. It can be the number of legs they have. It can be whether or not they can fly. It can be all kinds of things. But over time, there can be so many changes that are occurring and being passed on to the new group that these two groups, even if they were rejoined, let's say that river dried up and those two groups can now mingle with each other or communicate or try to reproduce, they may be so different that they can't even do it. So they're so different that they cannot reproduce. So since they are unable to reproduce with each other, that goes back to our definition of what even makes a species. If they can't reproduce together, they're not in the same species anymore. So we have two new species. We have this species of green beetles that can reproduce together, and this other species that can reproduce with each other, but not together, because they are two separate species. So that is exactly how speciation, or the creation of a new species, happens. It's just 1, 2, 3. Your group is isolated. They go through mutations until they get so different that they can't even reproduce. So we're two separate species. Pretty easy. The last step, there are different types of isolation or different ways your population can be separated. We're going to talk about 3 of them, and I think they're pretty easy. So first, we can have a geographical isolation go down. If you have ever heard the word or the prefix geo, you may have heard of geography or geology. Geo just means earth. So when you see geographical, just think Earth. So this is an actual physical barrier or something keeping the groups apart that is going to be present. That can be like the river in the beetle example. That can be in this example here. Maybe there's a giant mountain range, and if you're 2 little groups of turtles, you can't really climb a mountain because you're tiny. So that is going to keep them separated. So that would be a geographical isolation. It's something in the earth that's keeping them apart. Okay, the second one, I think this one's the coolest. It is called temporal isolation, or you may hear behavioral isolation. And we know what a behavior is. This just means that the way that they actually mate, the things that they do to make reproduction happen, they might be totally different. So one great example is maybe the 2 groups suddenly mate at different times. Like this flower here is trying to release its pollen, which remember we talked about is plant sperm. We talked about that a long time ago. That pollen, maybe it wants to release it in the morning, and This other plant is like a lot of y'all where you're like, I'm too tired. I'm not a morning person. I'd rather be up in the evening. So since they are totally mating at different times, they're not even going to mate. So they're just no longer mating. Or it can be different mating behaviors. So if you think about like a bird, certain birds will use different bird songs to like attract a mate. Like it'll sing a beautiful, beautiful song to bring a bird to its nest. If different bird groups are suddenly attracted to different songs, then the song's not really going to work to attract a mate. So then they don't even reproduce. So that would be a temporal or behavioral isolation. The last one, I think this one is the easiest, is mechanical. So mechanical isolation or mechanical differences just means that their mechanics are a little off. So their bodies actually physically cannot reproduce together because the way their bodies are made up, it just doesn't work. You can think about two puzzle pieces that don't fit together. It's just they literally can't do it. That's why you don't see an elephant reproducing with a beetle. You can use your imagination there. It's just not going to work, right? So these are three different types of isolations, three things that could totally make mating between two groups of organisms just not be possible. Okay, so that is all about speciation and what makes a species and how it happens. Pretty easy day. If you have any questions, please let me know and we'll practice this tomorrow.